All right, well, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started tonight. We're talking about tonight our focus is on the Apostle Paul, and we're going to spend 6 weeks looking at at Paul the Apostle, different ways to say that name. And, you know, it's an interesting question as to how you should go about this. And so what I wanted to do is just kind of show you kind of our plan of attack to talk about and think a little bit about the Apostle Paul. There's not really any perfect way to describe each one of these characteristics or parts of Paul's life, but they're all very important. One is his early life, and we're going to call that Paul the Pharisee tonight. It might have been called Paul's background or Paul of Tarsus or something like that, but it goes with the P that comes next, which is Paul the persecutor, and we'll talk about that next week. And then we'll talk about Paul the Apostle, his dramatic, powerful, life-changing conversion on the road to Damascus, and how incredible that moment was and how world-changing that moment was. And then we'll quickly trace through each of his missionary journeys. And so one of the things we'll be doing each week is I'll be trying to give you a lot of maps and guides as we walk through this to help you kind of understand it. I'll also try to give you some digital chronologies of Paul's life that kind of help you fit into different things so you can think through what he does. And, of course, we'll be very rich in our scriptures and walking through, looking at some of the key verses and things about Paul. So here are some really famous pictures of Paul. Artists through the years have tried to paint the apostle. One of the things, if you look at a picture of Paul, you're almost always going to see one thing is going to stand out. He almost always has a book in front of him, and you almost think that Paul was a librarian more than he was anything else. But I don't think these pictures are very accurate. I think Paul, more likely you would have seen him working in a tent maker shop, and his hands would have been rough. Here's another artist's effort of showing Paul, and it's also interesting when you look at the art of Paul. The artists always try to capture different pieces of his life and ministry. The sword is always an interesting one when you look at this one to think about why did they put the sword in there with Paul. And here's another one. In all three of those, he's got books, rather large books. It's actually anachronistic. They didn't have books in the first century. They would have had scrolls. And it wasn't until Paul finished his writing that we actually had books. The early Christians invented books when those books were put together. It formed what's called a codex, and they became known as codices. And that's the origin of books. It's one of the gifts that Christianity had to the world. Our key image is a mosaic. It's one of the earliest depictions of Paul, and it fits a piece of art, a depiction that we find in a very early yet unreliable source of Paul. And this is a common image of him and what he might have looked like. We're not really sure what he looked like precisely. But what we're going to do is not draw a picture of Paul over these next 6 weeks on the screen and on the canvas. We're going to try to draw a picture in our minds as to who Paul was by looking deeply at Scripture and looking at the rich background that we find in Paul's world. If we ask the question tonight, why should we study Paul? This is really one of those questions that sort of answers itself, because without question, Paul is the first theologian. He's the first person to actually put into thought what we call Christianity in a way that we could make sense out of it. He is the most effective missionary in the history of the entire world. He's the second founder of Christianity because Jesus, of course, is the founder, but without Paul, so much that we know of as Christianity, we wouldn't. 24% of the New Testament, just to be exact, was because we could say just a quarter of the New Testament was written by him. There are 13 books that have his name associated with them in the New Testament, but that's not all, because half of the book of Acts is the life of Paul and his missionary work. And if we stop and think about it, 2 of Paul's companions, Luke and Mark, wrote 2 of the Gospels. And so without Paul's ministry and missionary work, almost the entire New Testament that we know of today wouldn't even exist. And if you even stop for a moment and think about someone like Peter, in 2 Peter, you get somewhere near the end of it and he starts talking about Paul. Everybody was talking about Paul. He was someone of enormous significance. But if you had asked Paul, especially at a critical point in his life, what is the likelihood that you are going to become a Christian? And what is the likelihood that you're going to become a preacher? What is the likelihood you're going to become a missionary? Paul would probably be the most unlikely person to have done any of those things. In fact, the early part of his life, if we were to draw an arrow, it would be 180 degrees going this way, and afterwards, it would be 180 degrees going the other way. He is the quintessential example of a person whose life was utterly and completely transformed by Christianity. And he remains as one of the most powerful proofs, evidences that Christianity is authentic and true and has the power to change people's lives because of what happened in the life of the Apostle Paul. So that in and of itself makes him more than worth our attention to think about. But as we start to think about a guy like Paul, we want to pretend to be biographers for a moment, I think. And if you're going to draw a biography or write a biography about a person's life, you're going to want to ask some questions. And probably the first question that you're going to want to ask about Paul, the Apostle Paul, is this question. Where was Paul born? You know, if you meet somebody the very first time, one of the first very likely things you're going to ask is, where were you born? Where did you grow up? As I look around this room right now, I know the answer to that to almost every one of you in this room, because it's one of my first questions I ask you. Where did you grow up? I know those of you who grew up in Mississippi. I know those of you who grew up in East Texas. This is just how we get to know each other, is we ask the question, where were you born? Where did you grow up? And we have an answer to this question. Paul was born sometime between 5 BC and 10 AD. So we don't have his birth certificate. We have to figure that out, and it's a complicated process. But when we do, this ends up being the chronology, if we were to draw it out. And if any of you want me to send you any of these, I can, or you can grab it off here. But the only date I want you to notice is his date of his birth. And then you can see the death of Jesus in 29. Because that's where we're going to start tonight, is when he was born. But I want to ask this other question, which is the question I just asked. Where was he born? And we know the answer to that, but I want to give you a hint as to where he was born by showing you this picture. William Shakespeare wrote a tragedy about two figures who were contemporaries a little bit earlier than Paul. One was a Roman named Mark Antony, and there was a woman here. And did anyone have any idea who she is? Yeah, that's Cleopatra. It's Antony and Cleopatra. Anyone know where this is? Those are all likely places for it, but actually this happens, where their meeting happens at a place called Tarsus. And the question that when we ask the question, where is Paul from, we have a fascinating answer. Paul is from this place of fame and importance in the ancient world, so important that when Mark Antony and Cleopatra are going to meet up, the plan is to meet on the river that runs into this beautiful, famous metropolitan city called Tarsus. And we know this because Paul tells us this. In Acts chapter 22, this is one of the 3 times Acts records Paul telling us his story about how he became a Christian, and he starts with where he grew up. He said, I am a Jew. In case you don't know that, I am a Jew. He's speaking to a Jerusalem audience of people who aren't really sure. He says, I was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. This city is Jerusalem. I studied under Gamaliel, and I was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. To try to get an idea of where Tarsus is, because we have enough time trying to find our way around Texas sometimes, let me just show you a large, big picture map of the Roman world and some of the major provinces that are close to where Paul grew up. If you look over on your right, down there where it says Antioch, and you go south of Antioch is the land, south of that would be land of Israel. If you just go up a few miles, 30, 40, 50 miles, depending if you go across the Mediterranean Sea or if you take the inland route, you can see Tarsus there, right there 10 miles inland from the Mediterranean, with a very important river that runs through it, 30 miles to the north is the Cilician gates that opens up Tarsus to all of Asia. And you can see all these provinces that are all so famous in the New Testament, places like Cappadocia and Galatia. You ever heard of the letter to the Galatians? And then you can see what is called Asia Minor, which is Ephesus, and then you go across and you have Greece. This is another map. There's so many maps we could do, but this one gives a few more little points. So I wanted to show you kind of the one without the points, and then so you can see where Tarsus is there, and that region is Cilicia. It became Cilicia when the Roman general Pompey, in about 60 so, crossed over here and started conquering everything, including Jerusalem. And when he did, he named Tarsus the capital of Cilicia. He made it the most important city. And then later it was declared a free city. You want to be a free city because you don't have to pay taxes. So the status of free city is really, really nice. Everybody wants to go live in the city where you don't have to pay taxes. And that's the reason Tarsus had 500,000 people living in it as Paul lived there. An incredibly large city, metropolitan as you can possibly imagine. For Paul, a Jew, to have grown up there meant that he was not a Jerusalem Jew as people would have wanted to be. It meant that he was a special kind of Jew that they call a diaspora Jew, a Jew who lives outside of the land. But the fact that he did grow up here is so important. Tarsus, if you look where it is located here, and we go back to this map, you can see all of the west going to my left, or your left, and all of the western world. There's Greece, there's Rome, and then all of the eastern world going that way. Tarsus stood right at the middle of between the western and eastern edges of the world. It was a city of Roman influence, of Greek influence, Roman culture and Greek culture. It was a city lined with Greek gods and Roman gods. People spoke the languages of Rome, like Latin, and the languages of Greece, Greek, and they could speak other local languages. Tarsus was a unique place, and this may come as a surprise to some of you, in part because it was literally the educational mecca of the ancient world. Strabo, the Roman geographer, says that the education in the city of Tarsus rivaled that of Athens and Alexandria. So here you have a place that is the highest level of learning in the ancient world. And here is this young Paul growing up in this city where all of the world's thoughts and ideas are on display, where he would have had access to the finest schools, including the learning of the spoken oratory language or Greek rhetoric. He would have been able to be a student in those. It's also the case that he would have learned the great literature, not just from Genesis to Malachi, but the great literature of the Greco-Roman world. And that explains why in his letters and in the book of Acts, he is able to easily command the Greek and Roman cultures when he shares the gospel with them as well. It also explains why Paul's letters are not just written in free form, but they conform to the standards of ancient Greek rhetoric, and they're written with incredible skill that scholars today still try to figure out and understand all of the details of them. He also would have looked across and listened to one of the most important philosophers of the ancient world, the school of the Stoics, which would eventually make its way into Paul's writings as he deals with the church at Corinth. All of that because of where he grew up and where he learned what he learned. This is a Roman road that runs through the modern city of Tarsus. That, of course, is from Paul's day. This is what it looks like when you leave Tarsus and you go out into the fertile land. The reason this city was so well populated was because it was in an area that was so easy to grow a variety of different kinds of crops, including this flax seed that was used to make really fine linen. Some of the ancient people who walked through and visited Tarsus complained that the people of Tarsus were so concerned about the quality of their clothing fabric. And that's all they wanted to talk about, much more than they wanted to talk about anything else. So this was a culture that had a lot of luxury. It had tremendous amounts of wealth and education and learning. And this is where Paul of Tarsus grew up. It had a major travel route running through it, business routes running through it. This was a mecca of learning and also commerce. Now, I kind of want to just stop for a second and think about this question, because this is going to relate to everything we're talking about tonight. But we've been noticing that some of the experiences that Paul had affected him, some of his upbringing. And I'm wondering if some of your upbringing has affected you. And then I'm wondering how, if we're to understand this, does Paul's background affect him? And this becomes, I think, the window into why this is so important. Because literally, Paul ends up becoming the perfect person for God to use to reach the Gentile world. Here is a man who grew up in it, who knows it as well as anybody does. He sits between the East and the West. He has a command of all these different languages, all this culture, poetry and philosophy. He can relate to any audience. And then you think back what he says in 1 Corinthians 9. I became to the Jews a Jew, and to the Gentiles a Gentile. I became all things to all people, so that by whatever means possible, I might win some for Jesus. This is the person who could do that, partly because of where Paul was born and where he was raised. Now, one of the other things we know about Paul is that he was a Roman citizen. And a lot of times people pay attention to that. He was a citizen of Tarsus. And so it's, how can you be a both? And the answer is you absolutely could be both. That wasn't a problem. This is how we know he was a Roman citizen. He tells us, this is Acts chapter 16. Paul said to the officers, he's in Philippi, he's been arrested, he's been beaten. They didn't bother carding him and finding out if he was a Roman or not. And so he says to them, they beat us publicly without a trial, even though we're Roman citizens, and threw us into prison, and now they want to get rid of us quietly. No, let them come themselves and escort us out. Paul is a Roman citizen. What does that mean to be a Roman citizen? Well, it means a lot of things, actually, and not the things that we often think that it means. One of the things that it means is that he had the right to a special name. The Romans had a form for names that was a three-part formula. You had what's called a praenomen, a nomen, and a cognomen. We have a first, a middle, and a last, and it sort of corresponds to that. So the famous orator Cicero was called Marcus Tullius Cicero. We only know him by his middle name. We don't talk about his other names. And there was a proconsul that Paul meets whose name was Paul as well, named Lucius Sergius Paulus, and again, he's known by his middle name. What about Paul's name? Well, it's very likely that Paul was either a nickname, or in this case, as it's put on here, it was his middle name, because very likely his first name was Saul. We'll learn in just a moment. We'll read the passage. It says he was from the tribe of Benjamin, the most famous king from the tribe of Benjamin, of course, is Saul, the first king of Israel. And so it's very likely this was his birth name, and then Paul's either his middle name, or it may be just a nickname, because the words Saulus and Paulus are almost exactly the same, and if he was going to speak to the Greeks, he would be known by that name. Now, I know all of you know Latin, and so you don't have any trouble reading this, but this is a very famous example of how you could become a Roman citizen. It's called manumission. If you were enslaved and you were freed in the city of Rome, you'd join the class called the freedman class, and you were now a citizen of the city of Rome. To be a citizen of Rome means you were a citizen of the city, not of the country, but of the city. And this is an example of very likely how Paul became a Roman citizen. Not that he was enslaved, but it's very likely that either when Pompey came through or before, that his parents or grandparents had been arrested, had been taken as prisoners back to Rome, and then later freed, and then they were allowed to go to Tarsus, and then he enjoyed the benefit of being a Roman citizen. Now, in preparing these things, some of this I wanted to do on my own, and then some of this I wanted to find some shortcuts to presenting this. And so I just Googled, Roman citizenship, and I found some really cool slides, if you will. One of them says, it describes how you can do it: by birth, by manumission, which is to be freed as a slave, by military service, by an imperial grant, and so on. So there were various ways that you could be, but Paul will brag, if you read long into Paul, and he will say, I became a Roman citizen. You purchased yours. I was born a citizen of Rome. And that always carried a sense of weight. So why would Paul brag about this? It's because there were certain rights to being a citizen of Rome. You had the right to vote. You had the right to make contracts. Think of a world where you didn't have the legal authority to make contracts. You had the right to contract a legal marriage. You had the right to sue someone. You had the right to stand trial, which comes up in the book of Acts because Paul makes his appeal to a trial. You have right not to be subject to torture or scourging. I don't know about you, but that makes me want to become a Roman citizen if I live in the ancient world. Please, I do not want to be, tortured or scourged. And it also meant that you would not be condemned to death, especially crucifixion. Jesus was not a Roman citizen. Paul was a citizen of Rome, and again and again and again, he'll make his appeal. These are some of the same slides. You had to pay taxes if you're a Roman citizen, but Paul didn't because he was a citizen of Tarsus. So he kind of had the benefit of one without having to have to pay the other. You had to be in the military service, but he was a Jew, and Jews didn't have to be in the military service. So it's working out really well for Paul. And then he gets the benefit of a very special set of names so that he can go around and say, my name is Saul to a Jewish audience, or he can say to a Greek audience, my name is Paul. And he can do all of that because he's a Roman citizen. So this ends up really mattering in Paul's life. Roman law, if you're a Roman prisoner, you cannot be executed, beaten, tortured, put in prison without a public hearing. I don't know about you, but sign me up. Number 3 so if we're going to talk about Paul the Roman, just quickly, what about Paul the Jew? And when Paul writes the letter to the Philippians, one of the things that he says is he tells us that he is a Jew. Why would he need to do that? Because he didn't grow up in Israel. And to the people outside of Israel, the Jews outside of Israel, they would have said, Paul, I'm not really sure you really are a Jew because you didn't grow up there and you can't show us that you were. Let's look at your passport and see, are you really Jewish? So this is what he says. Listen to the way he says it as he writes to the Philippians. And the whole subject in this is about all of this topic. He says, though I myself have reasons for such confidence. Can you just hear the orator in him as he's kind of laying out this argument? If someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. And he starts to name them. I was circumcised on the 8th day. Why does that make you Jewish? Because the law says that's what you're supposed to do. And it also means that his parents took the attention to make sure that it would happen. So he was raised in a very strict Jewish family. He's of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin. That's interesting. It helps us understand his name. He is a Hebrew of Hebrews. That's one of those interesting phrases. People read that and go, what does that mean? It probably means that Paul is describing his knowledge of the Hebrew language and his affinity with Jerusalem itself and its culture. He's so Hebrew that he knows the Hebrew itself. In regard to the law, he's a Pharisee. Those are the strictest adherers of the law in the ancient world. So to say that he's a Pharisee means, without question, he is a Jew. And as for zeal, which is one of the most desired characteristics of a Pharisee and as of a Jew, he persecuted the church. He didn't just believe it, he took action. He moved in action against the church because he believed so deeply in his Jewish faith and Jewish beliefs. Now he does this because he's trying to prove to an audience that doubts his credentials. Is he really a Jew? And he says, here's my resume. You read it and you decide for yourself. Why does this even matter, though? You know, if you were in the stories series that we just finished doing for 6 weeks, we talked about the story of the whole Bible. The reason is related to that. Paul saw himself as the one to share the message that Jesus finished the story of Israel. He saw himself as a part of the one to tell this story. He was a Jew who's a part of the great story of God and his people, and then he is sharing that story with others. It's from the Jews salvation will come and the Messiah will come, and it's so important for him to tell that story from that perspective. And then finally, Paul the Pharisee. That's where we started. That's what we said we were going to talk about tonight. In just a moment, I want us to finish by looking at Paul the Pharisee. A Pharisee was one who was trained as a Pharisee, and you were trained by a rabbi, a teacher. That's what the Hebrew rabbi means. According to Strabo, the geographer, people who lived in the city of Tarsus, they would get their education in Tarsus, and after they got this incredible education, there was a tendency that everybody would leave, like you go away to college, and you go away and study somewhere else. And Strabo said, and then they don't come home. That happens sometimes in cities, right? I mean, we have that kind of thing happening. Well, what's interesting is that's what's happened to Paul. He studied in Tarsus, he learned in Tarsus, and then he leaves and he goes and he studies in Jerusalem. And this is one of the places that he says this. There's various places. I'm a Jew born in Tarsus, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as you are today. Now, if we're trying to figure out who this Gamaliel guy is, Acts tells us, actually, in the 5th chapter, it says that there was a Pharisee named Gamaliel, and he was a teacher of the law, and he was honored by all the people. So here is this highly respected teacher. Paul didn't just go to Jerusalem and study under anybody. He studied under Gamaliel, who also happened to be a member of the Sanhedrin, the ruling body that ruled Jerusalem, 70 plus 1. They were the ones in charge, and ordered that men be put outside for a little while. Then he addressed the Sanhedrin, and he continues his message there. There's various depictions of Rabban Gamaliel, the famed teacher who is in the lineage of two great schools of the Pharisees called the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. You can read all about it somewhere else and learn all about the different kinds of Pharisees there were. But what Paul does is he says, look, I didn't just learn it. I was steeped in it. I learned under one of the greatest teachers of it. It's interesting today to think about this for a few reasons. One, modern Judaism is not directly related to the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, but it is directly connected to the Pharisees. So modern Judaism that we know today has as its ancestry the traditions of Gamaliel and so on. The writings of the Mishnah and the Talmud and everything else that modern Jews use is directly connected to this stream of thought. So that's important. But perhaps in your mind you'll want to realize that ancient Judaism, which was so political in nature, shifted toward one that was just pietistic and religious in nature. One of the questions that sometimes comes up is, where do these Pharisees come from? Because if you read the Old Testament, you don't see it, and in the New Testament, they're suddenly there. The prevailing theory is that they arose during a time when a leader named Antiochus IV had come into Jerusalem and tried to forcefully convert all of the people to a pagan way of life. And a family named Judas Maccabeus, the Maccabean family, rose up, and they were a priestly religious family, rose up in violent opposition and overthrew these Syrian invaders who were trying to force them to live in this different way of life. They tried to get them to not do their circumcisions and not follow their puritanical rules and rituals. And out of that grew a group in Hebrew called the Hasidim, the pious ones. And most scholars believe that they are the antecedents to what we have in the New Testament Pharisees, which means that Pharisees at their very root at the time of Paul were people who were so passionate about what they believed that they were willing to use violence to achieve it. And that leads us right into the mindset when we start to read the letters of Paul. Why is he so willing to do what he does? Why is he willing to take such action in order to stamp out these people who are Christians? And the answer, we discover next time, and yeah, that's a teaser, will be on Paul the persecutor, as we look at Paul and try to understand the motivation. And next time I want to show you several stories that are so important to understand the way Paul was thinking, and then what would later help him to do the great missionary work that he would do. They would both come from the same source, what he refers to again and again as zeal. And so to find out more about that, we'll have to wait till the next time. So.